to focus on when we are connecting ourselves to each other. Then the issue of exchange of ideas. As a University of Johannesburg, we are one of the largest contributors to knowledge production in this continent. But we believe that knowledge not used for the benefit of society is no knowledge at all. So the knowledge that we produce, the ideas that we generate, must not just be for knowledge's sake. It has to have some form of utilitarian value, which is going to improve the lives of our peoples. So now, what does it mean to where we are? I think, Ambassador, the past is past. But I think if we forget about the past, if we do not take stock of the lessons from the past, we shall repeat them. If I were to go back to slavery, I know this is quite controversial. It probably would not have happened without collaborators. It probably would not have happened without ethnic divisions, where people who have captured somebody from another language group were much more willing to sell that person. And I think those are the lessons that are still relevant today. And if we forget that, it won't happen at the same way that it had happened, but it will be repeated again. So it is important for us to take stock of what has happened. Now, before I sit down, I just want to acknowledge several people here. The panelists, obviously, they have already been acknowledged. Our former First Lady, Mrs. Zanele Mbeki, I can see she's sitting somewhere at the back. Ma'am, we welcome you here. And of course, one of our leading intellectuals in the country, Dr. Vincent Mapai. I'm sure he has a lot of things to say. I can see when he's ready to intellectually pounce. He's sharpening his knives in order to engage on this. And also, I would like to also welcome Mrs. Young. Please, I think you have to stand up so that you can be given the acknowledgement that you deserve. So thank you very much. And with those few words, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Professor Pitjana, Professor Mwala spoke about economic change, technological development. How do you see those themes that he just discussed coming together? And is there a role that theology plays in that, in moving South Africa forward to a competitive advantage?
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. It's great to be in this panel today. It's great to be at this, Professor Maurala, this great university, and I mean it. The only thing I have to say to you is that you could do better by making sure that people know how to find places here, because I spent too much time on a tourist route around the university trying to find the right building to get to. And let me say also, while I have the microphone, I might not get a chance again to congratulate Ambassador Andrew J. Young on the award of an honorary degree by this great university, quite deserved. And many of us are very proud that you could come to be here in person for such an auspicious occasion. Now I note that the topic for today is captioned around the 25 years since apartheid. I do think that it is important to say that in that 25 years, this country has made great achievement. It's principally in creating out of the apartheid Bantustan of all kinds, a state, a new coherent, sovereign, democratic, constitutional state, with all the instruments of state that there could be. Especially in the early days, created out of the many a nation of patriots and people who were very keen and excited about being African and about being South African. And we've had some presidents in our country, not least Nelson Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, who really could get to the heart of who we are as South Africans and help us, if you like, to look proudly at who we are. And so certain things were done, and there were things that we're very proud of. But the challenges that we have, to some degree, I agree with Ambassador Young, to some degree. The challenge that there are challenges that remain. The greatest challenge is that as we create a nation, we have found that we've created a nation of haves and have-nots. We've created a very divided nation culturally, sociologically, and elsewhere. So the idea behind our constitution to be a nation of many languages, many cultures, many religions, that yet has a loyalty to and the integrity of being a nation of South Africans is actually not as strong as it may have been hoped. The second thing I think is that as a result of that, to some degree, because of the haves and the have-nots, the economy of this country clearly hasn't been able to meet the needs of all the people of this country. In other words, we did make policy choices in terms of our economy that evidently have just not worked sufficiently for our country. In other words, in many respects, I often say we were not aggressive enough in undoing the economic choices of the apartheid state. For good or bad reasons, we meant to try to hold as much of together of what we can in order to ensure stability for the economy and the social fabric of our country. But in effect, what that did is that it pointed at a continuation of a system of inequality that 25 years on is a big challenge and we may find very difficult to do. The third thing that I think we are struggling with in South Africa today is how out of the enormous wealth that we have, we create a system of ideas and a system of knowledge out of which we can build a system of tolerance and of innovation, much of it building on whatever was achieved in the past, but a lot of it, a great deal of new thinking that would be appropriate to the needs of the people of our country today and in the future. While much of that is being done, and by the way, South Africa continues to produce enormous amount of knowledge and research that is respected worldwide. But it is true that by all accounts, very little of that actually seems to make a difference where it matters most. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having the blackouts and the problems with ESCOM of the kind that we have today. Somehow something just didn't or doesn't work. I'm looking at these engineers, is looking at me skeptically. But clearly there are certain things that we need to do. And for me, the final thing that we have, and that comes to your question, given all of that, and this has been a theme of a great deal of my work and my research and my publishing. In order really to create a coherence in terms of what we were doing in the struggle and where we are today and where we want to be. We abandoned, I think, by and large, a system of values and morality that I want to believe was very much inherent in the liberation struggles that we did. And for that reason, we became a very selfish, individualistic, angry people for a variety of reasons, and not enough caring for one another as we might have been hoped. If we hadn't done that, frankly, we wouldn't have had the disaster of the last 10 years of President Zuma, which was an unmitigated disaster for this country. And if he had, we would have had the wisdom to remove him sooner than he began to settle into the union buildings. So basically, we are struggling at the moment. At the heart of our challenges and problems, you look at all the commissions, you look at what happens, the breakdown in our economy, all of it has to do with corruption and state capture, arising out of how barren we have become in terms of our moral capacity as a nation. So really, where are we going? I think ultimately we need to match these things together. We cannot have an economy and a system of ideas that is without a moral capacity and moral nature with it. Ultimately, we just have to learn that these things actually hold together. Maybe the greatest lesson we can learn out of the last 10 years is to realize that we cannot, in fact, be a success of any kind where other people think they can just enrich themselves from the sweat and the wealth of this nation in a manner that is without law, without capacity. And finally, I would say that one of the greatest things we did, not just producing the Constitution that we have, but to really make a serious effort of basing that constitutionality on human rights and freedoms and social justice for our people. No sooner had we actually elevated those important instruments than we failed in making them realizable for the people of our country. And the real challenge for us, if we are ever going to become a people who were once proud and patriotic, etc., we need to recover that which had lifted us up at the beginning of 1994, 1996, for example. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. President Frederick, being president of Howard University, one of the preeminent historically black colleges and universities, also being a surgeon, and your mentor being Dr. Lafall, he has this concept of equanimity under duress. We've heard some of the challenges. How do you suggest engaging under equanimity under duress, even-mindedness? I'm certain as being a surgeon, you've had operations where things have come up that you did not expect. How do we engage in this democratic process, this approach to democracy, 25 years after apartheid, with keeping in mind equanimity under duress?
Sure. So first, let me again express my gratitude as well for Ambassador Young, who happens to be one of my alum, and the things that he has done, I think, to not just move the U.S. and African Americans forward, but the nations throughout the world as a whole. So I certainly want to express my gratitude. So a few things, and I'll start where you started. So I am a cancer surgeon. I do mainly GI cancers. I'm also a university president. And I often tell people that it's far easier to do a complex operation than it is to be a university president. I think I was telling somebody earlier, it's probably the worst job in the world to have, to be quite honest. But having said that, I think there's a lot of opportunity to glean from that. Dr. LaFall, for those of you who don't know him, I think epitomizes what the future and opportunity is for South Africans. He graduated from a small college at the time, Florida A&M College, which is now Florida A&M University. Back in 1948, he was 18 years old, had 1 B on his transcript, took a standardized test. It could only apply to 2 medical schools at the time because of segregation of schools in the US, and did not get into either medical school. One of them was Howard. His university president petitioned the university president at Howard to accept him into the medical school. That opportunity that he received at Howard led to him graduating #1 in the class and going on to become the first president of the African-American president of the American Cancer Society, the American College of Surgeons, etc. He was a groundbreaking president. He always tells a funny story that he was not the first African-American president, technically, of the American College of Surgeons, because there was a South African surgeon who became president of the American College of Surgeons prior to him. He was a white man. Nevertheless, he was the first black African-American president of the American College of Surgeons. His life's work is epitomized by equanimity under duress. And just as in the operating room, if things start bleeding and going awry, I don't get to yell and scream and throw instruments. That's when we must get more focused. And I think, especially as you look at apartheid and after apartheid, I think there's some things that you can glean from what America has experienced. So the first is, the reason that Howard University could get someone like Andrew Young to attend was actually because of segregation in America. Because if he applied to the University of Georgia or any state school in the South and they admitted him, they would then suggest to him that they would pay for him to come to Howard University. And when you look at our alum from Andrew Young's era, that's how we got most of our students. So we had the best recruitment tool that you could expect. And that's how we got the various luminaries of our time. We could not afford to go into the South and recruit black students. Those students were sent to us by those states and paid for. Their college was also paid for by those states. And Howard University, as a result, congregated a lot of black intellects that went on to do great things. One of those things was Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. It was a landmark Supreme Court decision that decided that schools could no longer be segregated based on the color of one's skin and one's race, but rather schools had to be integrated. The architects of that particular case were Howard alum. They congregated around our law school and really worked towards putting that on the books. But let me tell you an interesting fact. In the South today, there are more schools with single-race students of greater than 75% of one race than there were before Brown versus the Board of Education. So while we had a landmark case to put a law on the books, what we have come to realize that even after abandoning segregation is you cannot legislate the moral compass that you were speaking to earlier. You can't legislate that. So you can put all the laws on the books that you want to put, but you cannot legislate culture, you cannot legislate morality, you cannot legislate humanity. And so that is a key component of what must be done. And these things will continue to progress and happen under our noses if you aren't vigilant about what you think is progress. Another example is the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act was passed to avoid discrimination against not selling houses to black Americans in many parts of the country. Since the Fair Housing Act, there are less black Americans who own single-family homes in America today than there were back then. Brown versus the Board of Education, which opened up the opportunity for blacks to attend any school that they would like. In America today, there are less black males who applied to medical school last year than did in 1974. So with all these laws and with all these progress, you must have vigilance. And you must make sure that that vigilance is set up in a way that allows for not just progress to be maintained, but you have to make sure that you have watchful eyes over anything that may cause you to backslide. So we now have an economic system in America that is more effective around the issue of segregation than Jim Crow was. We have an economic system that's more effective than apartheid was. So you don't need laws in the books to discriminate. You don't need laws on the books to avoid folks having the same opportunities. All you need is a system that is unchecked, that goes and gets set up in a way that allows that to happen. Now, I'm not someone of doom and gloom, though, because I have a 12-year-old daughter who is an attorney and activist who lives in my house. I'm not sure where she got her degrees, but she's well on her way to taking over somebody's institution. And I have a 14-year-old son. The two of them are probably two of the most compassionate individuals that I've come across. And I have to give all kudos to my wife. But there are a couple of things that I think they have been exposed to that I think bodes well for the future, that I think many South Africans can glean from. The first is that they have a global perspective. My 14 and 12-year-old have visited 30 countries. They have been to places where they otherwise would have read about or looked on the web. They've had to interact with people that didn't speak languages that they speak. They've had to eat foods and interact with cultures in a way that earns them the respect of others. So while technology advances, and while both of them can fix my iPhones much more quickly than anyone else, that human interaction is key for what must happen. You cannot respect people over a device or behind a computer screen. You cannot learn who people are over a device or a computer screen. So one of the things that I think Americans must do as we interact with South Africans is to recognize that that exchange of knowledge is a two-way street. We are not here to show you the way. We have failed systems that are constantly failing that we're trying to fix. But I think we can learn from each other and learn together. And so the practical things that we try to do at Howard University is to make sure that we develop exchange programs with South Africa that will be helpful. So our social work school and our law school have programs in Cape Town. My students come here every March and every June. They spend time here doing courses. For instance, the law school course in June, they do international business, human rights, and constitutional law. Constitutional law is taught by a professor, a South African professor. And last year, I got a chance to sit in the class on international business. I'm on the Federal Reserve Board. I know the President of the United States right now has given us a bad rap, but nevertheless, I got a chance to speak to the international business class. And it was fascinating. I sat in a class on the South African Constitution by a professor who I know is pretty famous in South Africa. And it was absolutely fascinating to understand how the Constitution was birthed, how it is progressing, and how you learn along the way. And so I'll close on the note that what we are seeking, and I think how we can be hopeful, because I think optimism must underscore what it is we're here about. There will be mistakes that you will make. There will be trials that will face you. But as long as you don't lose the moral compass of what the country is about, there is a great future. That moral compass is not just the president's right or the president's responsibility. It's not ministers' responsibility. It's not the vice chancellor of universities. It's all of your responsibility. If every single day, all of us focus on that moral compass and make sure that it is heading to a true north that we believe in, then I think you would be very, very proud 25 years from now as to what South Africa is and has become. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, President Frederick, you are absolutely correct. I think diplomacy begins in the home. And my daughter, she's here. Stand up, Meglin. She's been to 15 different countries to understand and appreciate other cultures. And it is key to have that symbiotic relationship that you spoke about, with South Africans learning from Americans, Americans learning from South Africans. So thank you. Professor Landsberg, what are some of the important tenets of South Africa's foreign policy, especially as it pertains to the US? And who do we engage? Do we engage the private sector, academia, youth? What are your thoughts?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you. And let me also start by just saying it's great to share a panel with not only one of the stalwarts of the civil rights movement in America, but I think one of the things that we don't recognize Ambassador Young enough for was the leading role he played on Palestine 40 years ago already, when it was not very popular to do so. So I just wanted to make that that foreign policy point. And then, of course, our own high priest of the fourth industrial revolution, Professor Marwala. Yes, you heard me correctly. I just called him the high priest of the fourth industrial revolution. How relieved am I that you asked me a question about foreign policy, diplomacy, and US-South Africa relations. So, international relations, foreign policy remains largely state-centric. We will have to continue to rely on the relations between our governments. The relations during the course of the past 25 years have gone through something of a roller coaster, on again, off again relationship. I think the relationship was strongest during the Clinton-Mandela, and certainly the Mbeki. I have to sadly say, and my colleagues from UG and the Vice Chancellor know, I always start with a health warning that even though I teach diplomacy, I'm not always very diplomatic. So sadly and ironically, the relationships between our two countries during the Obama years was not as strong as it could have been, both for domestic South African reasons, but also for American reasons. There is no doubt that, and Professor Pichana was candid, frank, and upfront about it, that the views held and harbored by America about South Africa's democracy during the Zuma years was not kind, to put it mildly. But I think it's also true that former President Obama had something of a chip on his shoulder about his African connections and heritage, and did not reach out as much to the continent or South Africa as he could have been. And I think he's admitted as much. One of the issues that bedeviled the relationship over the last 25 years is that you have, on the one hand, you ask for the tenets of South Africa's foreign policy. You have, on the one hand, a republic in Africa that is fundamentally committed to peace and peacemaking as opposed to war, and South Africa never took kindly to the militarization of diplomacy on the part of America. In fact, by President Obama's own admission, his greatest foreign policy failure was the illegal invasion of NATO in Libya in 2011, and frankly, the unauthorized illegal killing of a former head of state. He was by no means a paragon of democracy, brother leader Gaddafi, but today Libya is a shadow of its former self. What can we say about the current period under the belligerent isolationist attitude of the Trump administration? Africa hardly even registers as a priority. At best, it's a relationship in search of crude economic interests. We also had on South Africa's part a government under President Zuma largely driven by selfish economic interests for the regime, not always the national interest. There is much to do to restore the relationship at the state-to-state level. But I like your point about the private sector, and even though you didn't mention it, you alluded to it, The area where I think we underachieved the most or achieved the least is in the people-to-people dimension. And here I really want to echo the sentiments of the president of Howard University, making the point for the education dimension. We can do so much at the people-to-people dimension, and we cannot underestimate, in the era of the fourth industrial revolution, the importance of economic diplomacy, commercial diplomacy, science diplomacy, and of course, as they say, foreign policy begins at home. It's incumbent on our government to make sure that we get the fundamentals right at home. So is it for America, but we have to strengthen the ties between the people. So in a nutshell, it's been a roller coaster, love-hate relationship of sorts during the last 25 years, and I think we can do much, much better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Landsberg. Thank you. I echo your sentiments about the people-to-people relationship, and that's the question that I posed to President French. I have here in my notes, going beyond governments to the people. Being president of a historically black college in historic Birmingham, Alabama, where Dr. Martin Luther King decided to come to Birmingham, Alabama in part because of what the students at Miles College, what they were engaged in, the selective buy-in campaign, which in essence was a boycott. Being in the state of Alabama that has the majority of historically black colleges and universities, graduating the majority of black intellectual capital, HBCUs, how do we go beyond governments and engage historically black colleges, the 105 of them, with you being one of the longest serving presidents, to make certain that we have the people-to-people connection, that there's an intellectual exchange of ideas and engagement on that level?
Thank you, Professor Welch. Let me also join my colleagues in thanking this distinguished panel, thanking Professor Mawala for hosting us on the beautiful campus. And I would like to make the projection that due to your studies, due to your knowledge on the fourth industrial revolution, that this gentleman will one day receive the Nobel Peace Prize for your work, Professor. Yes, sir. I'd also like to recognize one whom I grew up studying and admiring, Ambassador Andrew Young and Mrs. Young. Thank you for being here. I studied Ambassador Young extensively, as I anticipated, actually going to Morehouse College, where my son is a senior now, and I was to live with Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., and Coretta asked me as I sat with her one day, well, would you mind on Sundays, we have lunch and dinner with Andy and those? I said, oh my God, I would love to. So now to be with you, Ambassador Young, it is an honor, and thank you for your work. Facilitator, Professor Welch, you raise a dual premise, and I want to touch on both of those, engaging South Africa in what we've learned in the United States, our successes and failures, as you intimated, including what happened there in Birmingham, while also not imposing our values and what we feel as Black and African Americans upon South Africa. I was recently in Rwanda, had the opportunity to speak also in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia at the African Union. And while there, we spoke of the collaborations as between the United States universities and African universities. And I was reminded, and I had to remind my colleagues that I am the diaspora. I am from Africa. I am home. So when my plane landed on Monday, I was home. So I've come home to share, and not to share from a position of an institution that's been there since 1898, but more of a symbiotic relationship. Because Professor Mawala was very upfront to indicate that the point of discussion, the point of departure from slavery reminds us that we are part of the diaspora. And the HBCU experience is a result of the diaspora. So what we come to do is we come to seek sustainable and equitable partnerships. We come to look and discover what the best practices are here at the University of Johannesburg and other institutions, and to tell you what our best practices are at HBCUs in America. We're very effective. We're very effective in what we do. And to be very clear and to be sure, when one looks at HBCUs, sometimes the assumption that we are monolithic in character. We are not. We are not monolithic in character, in mission, nor size. So while I sit with this distinguished president who has one of the largest enrollments of HBCUs in the nation, I also sit with small and moderate-sized institutions because we have our particular missions, which are very important. Our mission goes to teaching. Our mission, we are not a research one institution, but we are a teaching institution. So I get excited when I look at Teach for Africa, when I look at the club. But I would like for that emphasis to be on the college level as well. I would like to see the teachers, the instructors, the professors at the University of Johannesburg as you stroll across the beautiful campus of Miles College. And we collaborate and we understand that we are the diaspora. We are not foreigners, and you will be home when you come to the United States because where my home is, your home is. So I was excited when I saw these students because these look just like my students. You have the same goals, the same dreams, and the same aspirations as my students. So I come now to offer partnership, sustainable partnership, collaboration. And yes, Miles College, we have a storied history. And Ambassador Andrew Young, he was humble. He said when Martin Luther King did this, but it wasn't only Martin Luther King because he could not do it by himself. It was Andrew Young who was at his side. And we pay homage to him because there was a selective buying campaign because boycotting was illegal in the state of Alabama. So my Student Government Association president by the name of Frank Duke, he did the research. He went to the Chamber of Commerce. He went to the business department at Miles College. He said, how can we infiltrate the downtown business community? They said it's about green, it's about money. They came back with the result that if we were to boycott successfully, that we could adversely affect businesses in the downtown Birmingham business district by $4 million a week. The margin of those businesses for profit was 13%, but at $4 million a week, they were losing 25%. So that's how Andy Young got them to the table. You're losing money. So we were able to get Dr. Martin Luther King to come to Birmingham for Project C, Project Confrontation. And because of what happened on that little campus of Miles College, we had the 44th President of the United States of America, Barack Hussein Obama. We had the fair housing laws. We had the Voting Rights Acts because of what happened at Miles College. So now we come to seek collaboration. And what is it about? As I pulled to this beautiful campus, I compared technologies, facilities, faculty. I compare those to what we have at home. But at the end of the day, at the end of the comparison, when I look at what goes on in the outskirts of this beautiful city, and I see the poverty, it's the same poverty that we have in Birmingham, Alabama. It's the same poverty that we have in Washington, D.C. and in New York. So it's about coming together and emphasizing what Ambassador Young said. We did a great job with the civil rights movement, but we did not dig deep enough to deal with poverty. My last point about collaboration. When I finished and deplaned from an 18-hour flight from the States, my back, I was in excruciating pain. We went to try to find some assistance. We ran into one of my brothers, a medical doctor, sitting right here who I had never seen in my life. He took me to the hospital. He got me medicated. Guess what? My back is feeling great because of collaboration. And Bob Marley said that hungry people hurt. Someone else said that hurt people hurt people. I was hurting. My brother, who had never seen me, came to my assistance. That's the symbiotic relationship with which I come to this beautiful campus and to Johannesburg, and I say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President French. We have time for one more question before we go to the Q&A session with the audience. I too love South Africa. Last year, I was here 5 times in 1 year. President French is my president at Miles. President Frederick, I'm an alumna of Howard University. And partnership to move forward. What would it look like, a sustainable summit of common interests? Perhaps something like the Marshall Plan or something like the European Union or something like the African Union. But the emphasis on harnessing a long-term strategic plan between the United States and South Africa, and in particular, between institutions, academic institutions, historically Black colleges and universities like the University of Johannesburg.
Well, let me say, this has been really wonderful that we've come here together and we have been much more of one mind and one voice and one brotherhood and sisterhood than we could have imagined. And I think that I'm not thinking so much of a plan as an attitude, that we are one people. I don't think of one nation under God anymore. I think of one world under God with liberty and justice for all. And I think I caught that. The interesting thing about, and I say this not to discourage you students, but I don't believe any of our leaders in Atlanta, Martin Luther King, Maynard Jackson, me, Shirley Franklin, Kasim Reed, I don't think any of us were good students. You know, we made C's, we made D's. I say I neglected the hell out of my studies, but I damn sure got an education.
All right.
See, when I came off that campus, there was nothing that could turn me around.
That's right.
And I didn't know where I was going or what I was to do, but I've learned since. What I learned was what I hope you all are learning here, is learn how to learn and how to listen to and learn from each other. Now, I go back to Frederick Douglass and the Freedmen's Bank, that when slavery came to an end, the slaves weren't through. They went to Lincoln and said, we need, well, it was 40 acres and a mule. And what they meant was they needed, in addition to the right to vote and the 13th, 14th amendments, they needed an economic stake in the society. Now, the reason we didn't get it, and Abraham Lincoln was killed 3 days after Frederick Douglass got him to found the Freedmen's Bank. Now, Frederick Douglass had been a slave. He had taught himself, but he not only taught himself academically, he also put up the first $10,000 to found the Freedmen's Bank. Now, where did the next slave get $10,000 saving? You know, I mean, we were not bad off coming out of slavery. Not as bad off as we like to think. And we talk about how bad slavery was and want to blame white folks or black folk. We want to blame somebody for it, but we just didn't get to the economic question. And we still have not gotten to the economic question. Franklin Roosevelt got us a little bit there. Even Lyndon Johnson in the Great Society was attempting to build an economic floor to end poverty. And that's where we are now. And I don't know how we go, where we go from here, but one of the reasons why I've traveled around and always try to bring some smart people with me is that people here are doing that. I'm looking over here, the same young man whose mother and father educated Coretta King in Marion, Alabama in the 40s and got her and my first wife to go to college in a kind of Quaker background, just seeking to serve. We have employees here. I mean, we just happen to run the busiest airport in the world. And it generates about $50 billion annually. And we don't have any government money in it. We put it together strictly dealing with Wall Street. And when people talk about governments ending poverty, it's just not realistic. Governments are all in debt. Find me a government that's not in debt. True. And you cannot deal with poverty when you're in debt. And so we've got to free up our minds. And the young people that are coming here that are successful have found a niche in the global economy. Now that niche can be widened. It can be broadened. And it will be. Half the population on the face of the earth is going to be on our African motherland.
Yes.
Somewhere around 2050, 60, 70, it doesn't matter when, but of the 7 billion people on the planet, 3.5 billion of them are going to be African.
Yes.
And so we control the largest market. China is trying to come in and take it over. We fought off colonialism for 100 years or more and haven't quite shaken it off. But we don't want to shake it off completely. We want to learn what we can learn, and we want to get what we can get from anybody. But we have to know what we need. And we have to know how to serve the least of these God's children. And so I thank you for sharing. And I thank you, young people, for thinking and caring, because you can't imagine what God can do with you in the next 50 years. But it's not an overnight thing, and it will take time, but freedom is a constant struggle, and the struggle continues.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Mawala, do you have any thoughts before we go to the audience?
I think I just would like to thank the panel. I think the ideas are there. And we have had many ideas. I don't think we are, the issue is how do we implement the ideas? We have to move from the abstract to the practical. There are many things that have been put forward, exchange of people. Let it happen. Our students must come to your campus, your students must come to our campus. Cape Town is just one small part of South Africa, you know. The most dynamic part of South Africa is the commercial capital, and that is Johannesburg. And the University of Johannesburg was a formidable black consciousness activist
Thank you.
As a professor. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Questions? Do we have a mic that we're going to take to the, okay. Question. If you have a question, please stand. Can I ask you to speak closely into the mic and loudly?
Okay, sure.
Please state your name and the organization that you're with.
Okay. My name is Jerome Russell. I'm part of a family business that has multiple enterprises in Atlanta, Georgia. And my question is this, I've been looking at the status of income and wealth disparity in America, particularly among blacks and other ethnic groups. And I think someone mentioned the black consumer buying power in America is $1.2 trillion. However, we only, from a wealth disparity standpoint, blacks are, maybe 1% to 2% of the wealth of America. And then we're 14% of the population, but we have 1.2 trillion in buying power. And here in South Africa, I don't know what the consumer buying power is, but it's, 55 million people, I think 50 million blacks. And my question is this, is the income, and this is more to my South African counterparts, is income, wealth, consumer spending, educational attainment, and home ownership, all of those things that really create the wealth, are we measuring it, and what trend is it, has it been going into, and where do you see it going in the future?
One of you want to take it? Want to take it, Professor Mawala? Okay, Professor Lance.
I certainly won't have those figures. I think some of my colleagues in the next panel dealing with issues of inequality would address it more seriously. I just want to echo a couple of points to address your question in part, and then I also just like to take the opportunity to say something about the quote-unquote Marshall Plan. There is no doubt that in this country, there is not a crisis of democracy. We have an election planned for the 8th of May this year. It will be our 5th election on time. I'm confident, and I'm sure my colleague, Professor Ndlechana, will reflect on that, that we've never had a dispute of an election. I think the biggest crisis in South Africa is that there is a social crisis that is playing itself out here of astronomical proportions. Former head of state, President Mbeki, referred to a country of 2 nations and a country of 2 economies. Now that economy is no longer exclusively white and wealthy and black and poor, but the poor sectors remain largely black. We have a consumerist culture. Our joblessness figures are astronomical. You cannot hope to address the very serious social crime levels that we have in this country for as long as we compete for that infamous trophy of being the most unequal society in the world, where you have such high pockets and levels of poverty, and these poor people are confronted daily with opulence and wealth that simply knows no bounds. Those are the problems, to the extent that it's that there is a middle class. It's not large enough. It's not secure enough. Our economy is shedding jobs, not creating enough jobs. We rely too much on GDP growth. And even if that's the only indicator we use, the growth rates are simply not high enough. Just 2 final points. One of the irritations in America-South Africa relations is a concern on the part of the US, and justifiably so, that they've perceived a tilt towards BRICS led by China and a pivoting towards Asia or the Chinese, and the Americans don't take too kindly to that. Yet in BRICS, we are the smallest country population size with the weakest economy, and the economy growing the slowest. So we simply can't sustain uplifting the poverty. The one thing I liked about what both Ambassador said, as well as the other colleagues, is that while we can celebrate freedom for Americans because of the civil rights movement and democracy and liberation for South Africa in 1994, we have just not done enough to uplift our people out of poverty. And that is the soft underbelly of South Africa's democracy. And if we're not careful, our democracy will finally and eventually become corroded because of our inability to make inroads into these social ills of poverty, the triple helix of poverty, inequality, joblessness, and of course an education system that's simply not taking enough people with it. Just a note, a footnote on the Marshall Plan idea and the VC's challenge of the need for us to be concrete. One of the greatest initiatives that we are trying to cement at UJ, it's something that came about only in the last 4 years or so, Ambassador Young, you'll be interested to know, was the establishment together with the University of the West Indies of a Center for Global African Studies. Now, I tell you why I mention that. I think there's need for us, all of us in this room, and mindful of the fact that we are trying to consolidate a non-racial democracy. And that's what our constitution and negotiated settlement implores us. But it's the idea of going beyond a narrow notion of Pan-Africanism that only speaks to the motherland, continental Africa, and embrace the idea of a global Africanism that brings and places South Africans, patriots from the rest of the continent, fellow Africans, and of course Africans in the diaspora, the US, the Americas, the Caribbean, Brazil, and elsewhere, all on par as equals, and go forward with this people-to-people dimension.
Thank you. Thank you. We have time for one more question. Perhaps a student? Is there a student? Who has the microphone? Okay.
Thokozani, Sanbonani. My name is Malusi Mncube. I'm a master's student with Professor Landsberg, the one who's just spoken right now. Please allow me just 1 minute to read this. I want to preface my question to what I'm going to read right now. Lord Macaulay addressed the British Parliament on the 2nd of February, 1836, when he came to Africa, when he reported back to the Crown. This is what he had to say. I have traveled across the length and breadth of Africa, and I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief, a wealth I have seen in this country, such high moral values, people of such caliber, that I do not think we would ever conquer them. We have to break their moral fiber. I won't go ahead. Why I preface this, I want to pose this question to Ambassador Young and the rest who've spoken. I hear you speaking about the economic bent, that you just did not get the mule and the 40 acres. But in terms of collaboration, what ideas are you bringing on the spiritual front? Because our spiritual front reflects our economic front. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that I think feeding the hungry is about as spiritual as you can get.
Amen.
And I don't know who it was that said that peace for the wealthy is security. Peace for the poor is bread. And I think that we have to meet our brothers and sisters where they are. But the one thing I think that I don't think we can continue to do, we can't blame it on anybody else. Not that they're not to blame, but they're not going to feel the least bit guilty. They'll keep on exploiting as long as they can. And I think what we have learned is to compete. And these small, historically black colleges have been the basis of education. It's no coincidence for me that the Konini brothers and South African breweries came out of Adams College in South Africa. Adams College was founded by the same American Missionary Association that founded Howard and Fisk and Atlanta University. But we were founded in 150 years ago. They founded Adams and Fort Hare 168 years ago. And I think we've always recognized that there is a link between us. But there's so much distance, and it takes so much time to bridge these gaps that we almost have to do the best we can with what we've got. It was an African student on Howard's campus that grabbed me one time and said, "Boy, if you'd ever slow down and get civilized, you might amount to something." And I said, "What do you call civilized?" And he said, "You need to be able to recite a poetry for a mile and walk in each direction and never repeat yourself." I said, "Well, unless I can recite the blues and the Bible and everything else I know, I won't make it." He went back to Nigeria and founded their first, was a classmate of LaSalle Falls, and founded the medical university there in Ibadan. And my classmates at Howard founded the healthcare system in Nigeria. The anthropology students that I knew from South Africa came back here and did wonderful things. And so we've got to do it ourselves, and we can't hold anybody else responsible. The gentleman that spoke just now has inherited one of the largest economic operations in Atlanta. But it started with his father developing a shoe shine stand at 12 years old. And at 16, he bought a lot across the street from his shoe shine stand and built a house that he put up for rent, and that rental property paid his way to Tuskegee to become a contractor. And there was no scholarship, no help. He played a little football, so he got a little bit of help. But I'm saying that ultimately you've got to take responsibility for your own destiny. And John Hope Bryant, who's with us from Operation Hope, kind of convinced me that I had all these degrees, and I had a number of honorary degrees and everything else, and all that been to Congress and mayor, but I didn't know about my credit score. And they were making me pay 8% interest. When I thought about my credit score, I got my interest down to 3%. And suddenly, just managing my own money correctly moved me from When you pay an 8% interest, I don't care how much money you make and you're poor. You get to 3% interest, you're middle class. And it's just that simple fact. And we've got to understand the economic realities of any system that we're a part of. And I think that's why I put the emphasis on the economy. Because we can do what we must do and want to do with the economic order of our time. And we're going to be able to control it simply by the population. And I mean, can you imagine, you got 65,000 students here? I mean, they're all very, very intelligent, or they wouldn't be here. And as they begin to take on economic questions, as well as we've taken on teaching and nursing and whatever else we've learned, but entrepreneurship and learning to deal with a free market economy. And I don't know how we're going to change it, but some of us are going to have to, some of you all in the future generations are going to have to figure out how to make a global economy work. Because right now, the global economy is not working in it for anybody but the super rich.
Yes. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. Thank you, President Frederick, for your value added through your scholarship and your contribution. Thank you, President French, for your value added through your scholarship and your contribution to this discussion. Professor Mawala, thank you for your scholarship and your value added to this conversation. Thank you. Ambassador Young, thank you for who you are, your value added to this conversation. Professor Pinata, thank you for your value added and your scholarship in this conversation. Professor Landsberg, thank you for your scholarship and your value added. Thank you all. Let's give our guests a round of applause. So now we have our second panel. Dr. Rashatanga is going to moderate, and Ambassador Young, you're going to stay in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. May we please settle down for the next session. Please settle down. May the panelists of the next session please come forward. Settle down, please. We have another session. Let me request the panelists to please come forward. Professor Fiona Trajena, Professor Leland Ware, Professor, anyway, I can pick up. No, I'm going to move them around, so just sit anywhere you want. Professor Mcebisi Ntlachana, Attorney Anthony Carroll. Thank you very much, Professor Bashen Welch, for moderating the first session of this colloquium. May we give her a round of applause. My name is Chilidzi Rachitanga, and I should mention that there is one more university that's taking part in this colloquium, the University of Delaware. We will announce the panelist who's representing the University of Delaware here just now. I represent an organization called the Global Consortium for Africa's Economic Development. Together with the University of Johannesburg, we have a partnership that's looking at issues of Africa's economic development, particularly through an initiative of spatial transformation, that talks to the building of new cities which will anchor new economies in South Africa and the African continent. Very soon, we will be launching an institute that is specifically dedicated to this. It was during the course of promoting this work that we came across Professor Bashen Welsh of Miles University, who has been working with us and collaborating with us to forge relationships with African-American communities in particular. One such engagement, we cannot as South Africa but add to the list of universities that have honored our elder, our leader, civil rights giant in an intellectual environment, because he is indeed an intellectual giant as well. We thank Professor Chilidzi Marwala, my namesake. When we made that call from Atlanta last year, September, he did not hesitate one bit, and he said, "It shall be done." This has resulted in the moment that we're having today. This event, this colloquium, is the precursor of the conferment of an honorary degree to Ambassador J. Young later this afternoon. May we please give him a round of applause for this honor. Before I go too far ahead, taking cue from my friend and colleague, Dr. Bashen Welsh, apparently you need venue today. And as opposed to us who are here on the life of flesh, I will request you, Honorable Professor Chinua Achebe, if you agree that I should moderate this session. The answer is affirmative. If you did not hear that, or you cannot see Professor Chinua Achebe, I will advise you next time you go to an event at a venue that is hosted by one of those who are on the other side of life, you better take your spiritual eyes and ears as well. Otherwise, you will not know who else is attending that event. President French? President French? President French is homecoming. I learned about this at Miles College during one of the most important days in their calendar, a cultural moment, which is homecoming at the University of Miles College. And there was this gentleman who operated just like I did to announce that it is indeed homecoming. Welcome home to Africa. Ambassador Young is not receiving this honorary doctorate just for his efforts. He forms part of a gallant group of civil rights leaders, including amongst them Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Thurgood Marshall, Harriet Tubman, W.E.B. Du Bois. We understand absolutely that they fought the struggle to dismantle apartheid as much as they were fighting for the struggle against segregation in America. In receiving this honor, in participating in this colloquium, we would like to believe that we are also remembering them and honoring them as well. Thank you. We have to look at the factors that are impacting South Africa's progress, especially in important social sectors: education, youth, unemployment, healthcare, the economy, information and communications, infrastructure, and land reform. We have a very good panel that, beyond our honorable guest, Ambassador J. Young, includes as well Professor Fiona Trejena. Please give her a round of applause. Professor Fiona and I are old comrades who served together in the student movement a few years ago. It's lovely to reconnect at this moment. Professor Mcebisi Ndlechana, please give him a round of applause. Again, we share something common together. We are fellows of the Mapungubwe Institute of Strategic Reflection, and I'm happy to see you here this morning. Professor Leland Ware, please give him a round of applause. This is one of the leading civil rights struggle activist turned lawyer who is now a professor at the Joe Biden School of Public Policy and Administration, and it is under his wings and tutelage that I attained my PhD. I thank you, Professor Ware. Attorney Anthony Carroll, we also welcome you. Please give him a round of applause. And he brings to this panel particular experience insofar as the private sector is concerned. So now I would like to introduce this session by making this proclamation that apartheid created the material conditions that anchored a racially segregated society. If we are to crush apartheid in its totality, we must dismantle the material conditions that continue to favor a racially divided country. We must embed new material conditions that can sustain a democratic, non-racial, and equitable society. Some of you, our friends from America in the African American communities, faced these kinds of challenges a long, long time more than our 25 years of democracy. Ambassador Young was once a very distinguished mayor of the city of Atlanta. And I think that even when we were with you last year, you shared with us the great challenge that confronted you when you took over that responsibility. Of course, Atlanta has now become a worldwide renowned, successful city. How did you do it? What lessons can you share that would assist South Africa as it is moving away from a quarter of a century of democracy and with the challenges that you so very well know that it is facing that represent the legacies and vestiges of apartheid that are still seriously embedded in our society today? Your delegation and yourself have traveled around Johannesburg, around Gauteng, and those, you have witnessed the evidence of what I'm talking about. Using that experience, what is it that you can share with us and how all of that can help to lift up education, youth unemployment, healthcare, economic growth, etc.?
Well, let me say that I didn't want to become mayor. Nobody else wanted it. And they drafted me. And because I had been at the United Nations, and when I went to Congress, I didn't want to do that either. One of the reasons I think I've been successful is I've always been willing to do something that nobody else wanted to do. And if somebody else would want to do it, let them have it. I have no ambition. Because there's always something that nobody wants to do. And Maynard Jackson had done such a wonderful job as mayor. And in the process, he desegregated the economy to the extent that he refused to build our airport unless each contract was 25% done by a minority or female-owned business. Until Maynard Jackson became mayor, less than 1% of the business done by the city was done by non-white people. And he insisted in the construction of the airport and in the development of our mass transit system that 25% of every contract be done by a minority-owned firm or a female-owned firm, because white women were equally as discriminated against. And so with that, he opened up the economy to minorities and to women. And people got angry even though it was doing better than it had ever been before. And we built our airport without going to the federal government and asking for money. We went instead to Wall Street, and we sold tax-exempt municipal bonds, and we learned that while the federal government of the United States, that was supposedly the richest government on the face of the earth, it was deeply in debt, and it had no reserve. And so I knew that there was money all over the world. And I decided that I had to become mayor to bring some of the money into Atlanta. And money was so glad to come to Atlanta, as they would be to South Africa, because I went out and invited them. And I went to Holland. And the Dutch have huge amounts of money all over the world. And Dutch pension funds literally built 3 hotels in the first term I was in mayor, 2 Ritz-Carltons and 1 Marriott. And we went from not a single convention hotel all of a sudden to 3 or 4. And conventions attract money. The convention and visitor business is still Atlanta's largest employer, and it still brings more money. We now have 72 Marriott hotels in Atlanta because the money was good and people kept coming, and we learned how to entertain. And I see the makings of that right here in both Johannesburg and Cape Town, and we don't even have a wildlife district or wildlife parks and the native animals. But we passed New York last year in terms of convention and social visitors. But everything we've built with private funds from Wall Street. And you structure the deal in such a way that it pays for itself. And we learn how to do that, and we have just grown. But we had to be honest, and we had to be efficient. And all I had to do was say, look, we have an open door policy. You don't need an appointment to see the mayor. Just come to City Hall. I'll stop what I'm doing. I'll meet you. I'll hear what you're trying to do. I'll assign you to some person, and then I'd give them my home number. And I'd say, you don't have to pay anybody under the table here. If somebody tries to shake you down or you're not getting the efficient service that we promised, call me personally. Now, I didn't get but 1 call in 8 years because I gave the person my home number in the presence of the staff person that, that was assigned to work with him. And so it's just being transparent all the way. And when we developed that, we had to do a lot with, we have a lot of regulations, environmental regulations. You can't build a building without doing a lot of plumbing under the streets and traffic, and there's really a lot of confusion in creating a city. But we automated it so that a building permit that used to take 7 months to develop, we insisted that we put together forms and that you could get a building permit in 7 minutes. Our goal was that you should be able to get a building permit to invest or start a business in Atlanta in less than an hour, because the parking meters, you could put a quarter in and be for an hour. You should never have to go back and put another quarter in your, and if you had to put another quarter in your parking meter, we were doing something wrong. And it was simply a matter of saying, look, if you all can't do it this quickly, and we had really very bright kids, but nobody ever held them to those kind of standards of efficiency. And we said, look, we'll just have to get somebody else. I said, we're not going to fire you, but we'll just put you somewhere that doesn't require as much pressure. Well, we also said that as we grow, we're going to, as we increase the tax base, we will increase your wages. And so we're not going to raise taxes to give you a raise. You have to earn your raise by growing your department. And we ended up with 3 departments of development because the money was coming in so fast. We had downtown development, we had residential development, and then we had special projects like the airport, the stadium, and later on the Olympics. And it's just getting people challenged and to believe that it's possible that we can create a great city. And I think that's sort of what happened. The first term I was mayor, $70 billion worth of private investment came in. 1,100 companies moved into Atlanta, and we created over 1 million new jobs. We've grown the city from just a little around 1 million people now to 6.5 million. And we're moving on up to 7 million before long. Now, that means that for every problem we solve, we're creating 2. So we still have poor people, we still have difficulties with health care, we still have traffic problems that we can't imagine. And so we're not a perfect city, but it's certainly not from lack of economic growth. The Germans, I had been in Germany when I was a student, and the German business was taking off so well. I said to one of my friends at Lufthansa, I said, you know, you all are too big for Europe already. And if you're going to be in business in the 21st century, you're going to have to be in the United States. And the best place to be in the United States is Atlanta. So come to Atlanta and we'll help you get settled. Now, Maynard had built enterprise zones all around the city where we had space. We put in piping, we put in streets, so that if somebody decided they wanted to relocate a plant there, they could do it in 6 months. And so we now have almost 4,000 German businesses because of Lufthansa flying there every day. Japan Airlines started flying. KLM from Holland started flying. And when when the Japan Airlines came, somebody told me, you know, they own the Nikko hotels own Japan Airlines. So when they introduced me to the president, I said, you know, you can't be flying here if you don't own a hotel here. I said, you know, put up a Nikko hotel. We need a good Japanese hotel. In a month, they had it going up. Oh. I mean, people are that anxious to find quality, efficient, and honest places to do business. And I think South Africa has all of the ingredients that we have. You have space, you have bright people, and you have a near perfect climate.
Thank you. It sounds simple, honesty and efficiency, which speaks to the ease of doing business. If only our governments could be run that way with those two critical principles, we may be able to replicate what's succeeded elsewhere. I think Atlanta as a case study would be a great topic for any of the graduate students at the University of Johannesburg. There's a lot more we need to learn from that experience and what it may mean for our country. I have always said to people, there's a lot of unemployed capital around the world. And this is what Ambassador is saying. It's just waiting for the right plan, the right attitude, the right government that possesses these principles of honesty and efficiency to facilitate investors to come on board.
Can I just add one thing? That we weren't trying to bring people into Atlanta alone. We said Atlanta is the best place to base your business, to do business with 80, we can get you to 80% of the US market within 2 hours. Now you can do that from here. And if a half of the population on the planet is going to be in Africa by somewhere in this century, then everybody that wants to be in business has got to be in Africa. This is a perfect place to base your business. But you shouldn't just depend here. We're gonna be saying the same thing in Namibia. And we're gonna be, I tried to tell this to Robert Mugabe. I said, you got 10 years, 20 years head start on South Africa. You can make, you can make Zimbabwe the hub of Southern Africa. But he didn't trust capitalism. And I said, it's not a matter of ism. You know, it's money. And you put the money and efficiency. I mean, I bet you got 25% of the population of Zimbabwe in South Africa now. And they're all doing well. They could have been doing that in Zimbabwe. You know, and it wasn't Mugabe that messed up the government. It was the United States. It was Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher that refused to pay for the land reform. And he kept every part of his bargain for 20 years. And so.
Thank you for that addition. Professor Trajera, 25 years later of our democratic government, how can we move forward? I spoke earlier on the material conditions that undergirded apartheid are still very much rooted in our society. Do you think that the democratic government's programs are sufficiently dismantling these material conditions? What are some of the ideas that can make us move forward positively so that we can affect poverty, unemployment, which affects the young people the most, quality education and healthcare, and of course, drive an economy whose distribution will improve people's lives?
Thanks, Chilitsi, and greetings to Ambassador Young. It's an honor to be here with you. This panel has quite a complicated topic, and the moderator has also added to the brief. What I want to ask in my brief remarks here is, why have we as a country not achieved more in the last quarter of a century in terms of undoing the apartheid legacy and fundamentally addressing the triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, and achieving better growth and development outcomes than we have managed to do? Sometimes I think that when we're in the presence of outsiders, we have a tendency to become a bit defensive against criticism. But here, we're amongst friends, and I'm sure we can have an honest reflection on these crucial issues. If we cast our minds back to the early 1990s, I think we would have imagined that we would have been much further today than what we actually are. And this is not to deny the massive progress which has been made, and to underestimate the transformative impact of the rollout of housing, water, sanitation, and how this affects people's lives and dignity. I think it's obvious that no other party or movement in the current South African political landscape could have done anywhere close to as much. But there's still vast progress which we haven't made. Perhaps we were a bit naive with unrealistic expectations, but I think we could have gone a lot further than we had. The fact that poverty, inequality, and unemployment remain as high as they do 25 years after democratization is, in my view, quite a devastating indictment of our record under democracy. Nobody can honestly say that we've done enough. And I think it's also important to recognize that this wasn't inevitable. It didn't have to be like this. In some areas, the policy choices that we've made have actually made things worse. In other areas, I think they just haven't gone far enough in undoing the legacy of apartheid and colonialism and putting us on a fundamentally different trajectory. So even today in 2019, we remain with unacceptably high levels of inequality, unemployment, poverty, levels which are unacceptable and unsustainable, whether politically, economically, or morally. And the fact also that these problems remain highly racialized in character. Some advances have been made, particularly in terms of reducing poverty, I think. And in large part, this has been through social grants, which I think is both a strength and a weakness of our economic policy record. So at the moment, a large proportion of the South African population receives these grants, particularly the child support grant and the old age pension. And the evidence is unambiguous that without these grants, poverty would be much, much higher than it actually is. So on the one hand, these interventions have made a crucial difference to people's lives. Yet at the same time, it's of course far from ideal to rely on social grants to lift people out of poverty. What we really need is a more structural transformation of the economy towards a more inclusive economic structure in which the majority of people are involved in and gain incomes from the productive economy. Even though we talk ad nauseum about what we call these triple challenges, I think we haven't always appreciated just how interlinked they are. And furthermore, that policy choices which we as a country have made haven't always reflected our stated priorities. In particular, the question of unemployment, which as we know is at extreme levels in South Africa. It's wrong to look at this just as a narrow labor market issue. And I think it's also not feasible to really address either inequality or poverty without drastically bringing down unemployment. The kinds of unemployment that we're sitting with has got pervasive effects, not only economically, but on the basic social fabric of our society, on people's self-worth, on family and community cohesion, and so on. Everyone agrees that it's a priority, and obviously it's not something which is easy to address. But at the same time, I don't think we've taken decisive enough steps. Perhaps some of the reasons which one could reflect on as to why we haven't achieved more. In my view, the political settlement which we made was a constraining one, but even within the ambit and the parameters of that settlement, there's a lot more that we could have done. I think the period of democratization in the last quarter of a century has been a difficult one in terms of global conditions. Our democratization took place in a period in which the US was playing a hegemonic role globally. And I think there's various negative influences on that for countries such as South Africa. But even having said that, I believe that the explanations for what's happened, good and bad, over the last quarter of a century are primarily of a domestic nature and relate to our own political economy, and perhaps a lack of political will to take difficult decisions when they counted. I think we've also underestimated the intransigence of the economic structure which we inherited, the low growth path, the barriers to entry, and so on. I think we could fundamentally characterize our growth and development path that we've followed under democratization as one which has been more redistributive in nature and transformative in nature. And what I mean by that is that we followed a largely redistributively oriented strategy in which we've remained with largely concentrated ownership and control in the economy, a low proportion of the working age population in gainful employment, and then through the tax system, as well as through other formal and informal redistributive mechanisms such as remittances, we've provided at least some level of incomes to those not receiving incomes from work, through social grants, through the rollout of housing and healthcare and so on, which have obviously been absolutely crucial interventions. But the challenge which has remained is that making the basic productive structure of the economy more inclusive, such that more people earn incomes from work or from direct stakes in the economy. And my final comment on that is that this challenge is perhaps further complicated in the age of the fourth industrial revolution, where on balance, inevitably, some people will be displaced from employment due to automation. And this raises the question of whether policy in South Africa and globally should focus primarily on mitigating those job losses or finding ways of sharing the gains of technological progress beyond livelihoods from work. I think the fundamental lesson is that it can't be business as usual in South Africa. If we really want to change things, we can't continue as we have done. Otherwise, we won't be able to address these deep-seated problems. So we really need fresh ideas and very decisive action.
Thank you, Fiona. It's a lot of food for thought. Now, Professor Leland Ware, I know that you've studied the similarities between the South African struggles and the civil rights struggles. And in fact, you have written about Nelson Mandela and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and as symbolizing their leadership characteristics, but on the basis of the similarities of our struggles. Now, the dissimilarity index that looks at inequality in America, I think demonstrates that even 60 years after the abolition of segregation laws, there is still a lot of inequality even in that society. What are the lessons that we can learn from the journey that African Americans or America has traveled that could help to lift us up and address the kind of things that Professor Trejena was outlining are still major challenges, in addition to everything else you had wanted to share with us today?
Thank you so much. I am first want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this colloquium. I'm really delighted to be here, and I was one of your constituents. We're from Atlanta, and I lived in your district when you were a congressman.
You can speak up a little bit, please.
Is the mic on? Okay. There are very similarities between the South African struggle and the civil rights struggle in which Martin Luther King and others led. And the system of segregation and apartheid are so strikingly similar that you think that you're in the same place with doing the same thing. And likewise, the status of African Americans in America and the status of Africans in South Africa is kind of the same in that there are vast wealth disparities. The level of poverty in Atlanta is quite high among African Americans. The level of unemployment is quite high. So you have a bunch of wealthy or very high-income African Americans driving around, living in nice homes. But then you have a number of other people in other neighborhoods that are not that different, perhaps not quite as bad as the neighborhoods here in South Africa, but the disparities in wealth are the same. So segregation, there are the vestiges of segregation, especially in the case of housing. Segregated housing patterns in Atlanta and every other large city in America are at pre-civil rights levels or close to it. And the point of that is not that black people have to live next to white people to be fulfilled. The point is home ownership and wealth building. And after World War II, when the suburbs were built and the government, American government, subsidized the construction of the suburbs, they set in place a wealth building intergenerational program from which blacks were excluded by federal policy. So we're still living that, and researchers have attributed the low levels of black wealth, which is simply almost nothing, to those generations. So here in South Africa, there is a vastly wealthy country. Every time I come here, I'm impressed by the wealth that I see, the buildings, the highways, and the homes. So at the last conference I attended like this, people were complaining, but to me, the difference in the past 25 years is astronomical. I mean, think about what it was in 1990 or 1995 and what it is today. So I think that the contributions of those have to be commended. And of course, there were setbacks and there will be setbacks, and there was, some leadership issues here in South Africa under Zuma, as they are in America under Donald Trump. So we have to work our way through these things. But I do we were asked to project about the future of South Africa, and there's some trends. I teach a course on cities, and there's some trends that I see. First of all, if it's not already a megacity, Johannesburg and Pretoria will be together a major megacity. I'm a lawyer, and I was trained to speak to audiences like this, so I can just project my voice. Now, I want to zero in on what are the problems or the future that South Africa has to deal with. And I think it is the high levels of poverty, the high dropout rates, and the lack of skills that people have. So I think these payments that are being made are okay as a floor. But what South Africa needs to do is to train its young people so that they can compete in this increasingly technological marketplace. South Africa is growing. The new jobs are in the technology and related industries. And so it's just a matter of training students to be able to compete for themselves and earn living so they won't have to rely on government subsidies and to purchase homes. So that, of all the problems, for example, land distribution is a tremendous problem. 70% of the land, I think, is owned by whites. So there's, and the tribal lands that have to be kind of figured out. So there's many issues, but the question is, what would be the where to concentrate and where to put your resources? And I would say, in my view, because even when it comes to education, there are just not even enough buildings to house students. So if you want to make an investment that's going to pay off in the long run, I think it would be education would be my suggestion. And I think also Dr. Rachitanga's dissertation addressed an important issue. And that is to have a vision going forward. And that vision going forward has to kind of get beyond the ghosts of apartheid, which are very visible, that you can see every day in South Africa. And one of his suggestions is to build new cities, a group of new cities that would create jobs that would create infrastructure, and that would lead the way. And it's just not just economics. There's sort of a psychological issue. Is this on? Yes. Okay. So when I was walking, or not being driven through Alexandria, I looked there and I said, you know, that is apartheid. But there are places and neighborhoods in America where you can look and see the vestiges of segregation. So these things have to be addressed. And I think sitting on top of what was in Pretoria and in Johannesburg and in Cape Town, you're always living with these ghosts, you know, in this post-colonial era. But I think there has to be a vision going forward and to move into, or more deeply into the 21st century. And I think ridding, because the money, there are too many buildings in Johannesburg. I saw a law firm, an American law firm, Hogan and Hartson, has an office here. There's too much money, too much commerce here to run the country. So it has to, but the problem is the disparities. And the disparities have to be worked on here and in America. So those are my comments. And as far as the future is concerned, I just want to say end with this. Every morning in Africa, a gazelle wakes up. It knows it must outrun the fastest lion or it will be killed. Every morning in Africa, a lion wakes up, and it doesn't matter whether you're the lion or a gazelle, when the sun comes up, you better be running.
Thank you for those remarks. So, Attorney Anthony Carroll, I could ask a simple question about how to improve the ease of doing business between America and South Africa, and how that's going from a point of view of somebody who's involved in industry, trade, and economic activity. But I want to take cue from Professor Trangena, who says that that's not the only thing that matters. What matters is how to make the productive structure of the economy more inclusive, how to make economic structure inclusive, because that too is the responsibility of the private sector and not just government. So in addition to your thoughts about how to move forward 25 years later from the point of view of trade and investment, can you give us some comments on how we can move forward to make sure that the economy is inclusive? Ambassador Young spoke about how ordinary people should be enlightened with the basics of the economy, what somebody else called making the invisible economy visible. What is the contribution of the private sector, America and otherwise, in regard to this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Dumelang, Kitumelo Itse, Igole. I feel like I'm at home. Let me say this at the outset, how honored I am to be here on this panel. When this opportunity was presented to me, I jumped at it. And let me tell you why. My sister, as a young college student, got on a bus in New York and was a freedom rider to the South. And she worked on social and economic injustice in America. And unfortunately, she came back from college and having been a social worker in Watts after attending UCLA to get her master's in social work, and she died in a car accident. I decided to carry that torch, and I joined the Peace Corps because she had wanted to go in the Peace Corps and she didn't get the chance. So in 1976, I arrived in the dusty, dirty field in Gaborone, Botswana, arriving as a Peace Corps volunteer. And the first thing I did was get on the back of a pickup truck and drive into the countryside and spend 6 weeks learning to speak Setswana. I became a district officer. I became a district commissioner, if you can believe it or not, working in Gaborone and Ramutsa, right on the border of South Africa. And I was bringing a fellow volunteer from training whose mother had passed away, and they said, Tony, you look like you can drive a truck. Can you take him to the airport? It was then called Jan Smuts International Airport. And so I drove him to the airport and I dropped him off, and you couldn't cross the border in Botswana after 8 o'clock at night back then. So I had to stay at the Johannesburger Hotel in Joburg Park, and it was in the weekend of June 16th, 1976. And it was the beginning of the end of apartheid. You could just tell that the whole manner of South Africa's social interaction and the structure that apartheid built, starting with Reverend Verwoerd, was going to unravel. But let me tell you, it unraveled more quickly than people envisioned because of this man here. This man, Don McHenry, Leon Sullivan, Randall Robinson, were the leaders in galvanizing American interest on the oppression that was created by apartheid. And I'm honored to be in the shadow of this great man who certainly informed all of us about the injustices of apartheid. And also, I think we all have to attribute much of his leadership to the fact that this did not become a bloodbath, that South Africa certainly went through its challenges in that transition period. But it was people like Reverend Sullivan and others that really kept this dialogue going. And I think we owe a great debt to him for this great creation that is resolved. And turning swords into plowshares, how in 1976 you would come to Rand Afrikaans University and you wouldn't see any of people of color unless they were carrying a broom or pushing a tea cart. And here we are right now in a student body that is more diverse and open. You have accomplished a lot in many areas. I've spent the last 2 days on the board of an oncology project in Africa at the University of Stellenbosch and at Red Cross Hospital in Cape Town. And not all money in South Africa, public money, is wasted. The level of care and the sympathy and the confidence that people are administering to the ill in South Africa is there, and you have a lot to be proud of. So there's things that are working well and other things are not working well. Let me talk a little bit about the reason that I'm here, which is informed by 30 or so years of doing business in Southern Africa. There are, as many of you know, there's still a large presence of the American private sector. Many left during the period of apartheid, thanks to the leadership of Reverend Young and Leon Sullivan, but many have come back. South Africa has about 600 US companies that are operating and doing business here. The trade relationship between the United States and South Africa is robust. We're large investors, usually among the top 3 foreign investors in South Africa, and we're among your top 5 trading partners. And a lot of that received a boost because of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, which is a piece of legislation that included South Africa in one of the most liberal trade regimes that the United States has ever negotiated. South Africa has actually been the greatest beneficiary of AGOA, in part because it has the most sophisticated economy. South Africa exports automobiles to the US market. You're the largest supplier of whole oranges into the United States market. You make industrial products that we buy. So South Africa has a robust trade relationship with the United States that was accelerated because of AGOA. We're also large providers of development assistance. Nothing has been mentioned of PEPFAR. PEPFAR has made a huge difference in how South Africa has encountered and addressed its HIV/AIDS crisis. It took too long. I think all of us in the room know that. But the fact is that South Africa is managing its HIV/AIDS crisis on its own, but with important assistance from the US government. South Africa, as been stated before, to me, is the gateway to Africa and a gateway for American businesses to do business in Africa. South Africa, MIT each year, and we have some MIT alums here with us today, produces an economic sophistication index every year. And South Africa is hands down the most sophisticated economy in Africa. It competes with Chile, it competes with countries in Europe. South Africa has a vast array of institutions and businesses. It has one of the oldest capital markets in the world. The South African Johannesburg Stock Exchange is among the oldest stock exchanges in the world. Your customs agreement with the Southern Africa Customs Union is the 4th oldest customs agreement in the world. So you have an outward-looking economy. You have sophisticated institutions. You have an informed and educated workforce. Sure, it's not equally distributed, but the fact is that you have something that American companies will seize to work with. Apart from that, I think we are talking about some of these issues pertaining about how the American private sector can be accelerants in change. Moletsi Mbeki came to speak at the U.S. Institute of Peace about 2 years ago. And as many of you know, he's a thought leader in South Africa. His brother was a president. And he said, when asked about what could the United States contribute most to the evolution of our relationship with South Africa, and the question was answered by the late and great Ambassador Princeton Lyman, who was the ambassador here during the transition from apartheid, and a man that I walked in his shadows for many years. And Moletsi Mbeki said, look, we really have, and Msebisi has written greatly about this, we have good institutions of governance. We have democratic elections. We really can do that on our own. But what we really need from the United States is your ability to deploy creative capital and your ability to be able to transfer technologies. That's the thing that we really need from you. We really don't need any guidance how to run an election. We really don't need to draft a constitution from you. We can do that on our own. You've done a really good job. And your institutions have prevailed. The fact is that you had misrule for 8 or 9 or 10 years. The fact is that your media, your judiciary, and your legislature came forward and demonstrated their independence to confront what was a regime was heading in the wrong direction. And your institutions are stronger, just as coming out of Watergate, our institutions and our relationships with the executive branch changed greatly. So you will survive this era. It may take some time, but your institutions are strong. But what the U.S. can do in terms of its private sector is be a change leader, a factor in change. And I'm just going to point out a few examples here of where I think this is happening in brightly lit. Firstly, we'll talk about a few companies. General Electric, which started doing business, this is the first country that General Electric established a business base outside the United States. They did it in 1898. They came here to set up power plants for the mines here on the Rand and in the Reef. So GE has had a long relationship here in South Africa. They've spent $500 million to build an innovation center. That innovation center will be deployed to improve conditions on medical supplies, medical technology, power technology, manufacturing, and industrial capacity. IBM has set up a $1 billion Rand research lab. That research lab is going to be used to develop tools particularly focused on accelerating STEM education in South Africa. They have a program called P-Tech, which Premier Makura has visited in the United States, the Premier of Gauteng. And this is a tool in which that you can shape your workforce and empower them with skills and tools that the marketplace will be ready to do. So that P-Tech program is being led by IBM. J&J, which is a company that's been here for a long time, invested in the Chris Hani Burn Center at Baragwanath University, the largest hospital in Africa. That has not only benefited the care and treatment of tens of thousands of South Africans, but they've used it as a teaching hospital for the rest of Africa that now come to learn at Baragwanath and how to treat with burns. Broadreach, a company that came here about 10 years ago, founded by 2 graduates of Harvard Business School, have set up a company to do data analytics in not only in administrative government services, but also in the private sector. They now have 1,000 employees in South Africa, and they've used South Africa as a tool to train all their other employees in 8 African countries. And lastly, Bristol Myers Squibb Foundation invested $50 million in the creation of a pediatric oncology project called Global Hope. We are now going to be, just these 2 days in Cape Town, looking at setting up a training center to improve excellence for pediatric oncology, not only in South Africa, but across Africa, so that we can bring students, oncologists, not to Houston or not to Atlanta, but to South Africa to do their training. So I think there's leadership there in the that the American companies can deploy. And this isn't a China-America a debate. I think the Chinese are investing in things that are important that Africa needed that we don't invest in, and I think we need to give them credit for that. But I think there's a different style in doing business. I think the Americans tend to spend a lot of time in training their employees. I don't think we tend to, I think every American company objective is to have 100% local workforce and not bring expatriates in. I think we're not afraid to share our technologies. We're not hiding our technologies for their own purposes. We're trying to share our technologies. There are exceptions, and I can't say that that's the case for all companies, but we also operate at, I think, in high standards, in part because our legal regimes require us to do that, and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act require Americans to be accountable for their business practices globally. But what is needed in South Africa to attract further investment and business with America is to continue to create an ecosystem for innovation. I think you need to have coherent regulation, and I think you have to create the ability of being able to innovate with having global standard IPR laws and be able to work with institutions and academic institutions across the world. You need to have coherence in your business regulations. You look at the work that Reverend Young has done in Atlanta and how to be able to register a company and being able to get a business permit. I mean, that's very powerful. If a company has to come here and spend 3 weeks just to get a telephone line, that's going to be a real problem. Investment in infrastructure. I think South Africa needs to continue to push on investing in its infrastructure. Some of your infrastructure, if you look at a comparison on global standards on port infrastructure, South Africa is way at the bottom. You need to continue to invest in infrastructure, and you need to open up for competition. I think the idea of data access, if we're looking at developing the fourth industrial economy, you're going to have great and world-class availability of broadband. And that's going to probably require more competition to be in that space so that you can lower prices. Skill development, we've talked about, and we can talk about till the cows come home. This is a problem that South Africa is confronting. It's a legacy problem from apartheid. My first paper on South Africa was looking at the disparity of school expenditures per capita between Bantustans and other schools in South Africa, and the difference was absolutely shocking. It was between 20 and 30 to 1 of Rand per student. That's a legacy that's going to take a long time to undo, but I think we now have tools with the internet and global access that we can try to use these type of P-TECH programs to accelerate development. And I think we're looking at labor flexibility too. I know that's a tough topic here in South Africa because of the legacy of apartheid. But I think from what I've heard from small businesses in South Africa and companies that have located here from the United States and elsewhere, labor inflexibility is a problem. Hiring people, firing people is a big problem. And as Edward Young said, we didn't fire people, but we moved them to other jobs. Well, sometimes in the private sector, you actually do have to fire people because if they're either stealing or they're not doing their work or they're undermining your corporate objectives, that's how the real world works. So I think labor flexibility is something that I know is a tough issue to take on, but I think it's one thing that many South Africans recognize as it inhibits business growth. So I hope that I've been able to address some of these questions and available to answer any questions. So again, thank you for this honor of being here.
Thank you, Attorney Carroll. I was earlier on supposed to introduce Mr. Franz Baleni. I'm not sure if he's still here, but he was with us earlier on, and he is a former Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers. And I was going to be very curious as to what he thinks about Attorney Carroll's advocacy for labor flexibility.
By the way, we're good friends.
Yes. So we are running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to ask our last panelist to speak. It might affect question time, but we will see when we get there. Now, Professor Ndlechana, you are a political analyst. None of these bright ideas can succeed with a bad leadership. And President Fredericks earlier on was saying that you cannot legislate honesty. You cannot legislate Ubuntu. You cannot legislate humanity. And obviously, there is a new narrative. The post-Zuma years were coming out of the terrible 9 years. Actually, this narrative is so dangerous because it's starting to even replace apartheid as the real cause of the vestiges and the troubles that we're still confronting this country. But when that happened, that fateful December in Nasrec, we were told that we are on a new dawn. We have a new leader, President Ramaphosa. The signs are there for change. He is dealing decisively with corruption, all manner of investigations that are revealing just the rot that confronted this country. Is all of this taking us on a highway to prosperity? Are we on the right track to dismantle inequality that continues to bedevil our society? In addition to your comments that you had prepared for us, could you also tell us about the situation with regard to the leadership of our country as it prevails currently. Adding into that, the dynamic of younger leaders that are coming up. Do we feel that we have a promise of a good future, or do they have an agenda at all?
Yeah, 4 questions in one.
You can answer them in one answer.
Mr. Ambassador, one of the elders present here, who's one of the most respected and principled men, has already welcomed you. That is the Reverend Professor Panipikian. As the elder, as a youngster, I need not add on what he's already said. That would suggest that he did not do a proper job. Anyway, thank you for coming, except to add that part. Talking of, before I answer your multiple questions, Chilizi, I just need to say this one bit of historical note. Talking of historically Black universities, one of the first Black universities in South Africa and one of the oldest in the continent, Fort Hare University, which was established in 1916, its initiation had something to do actually with historically Black universities in the US. In the late 1890s, Black folks started going to the US to seek higher education. They were brought over by the ME Church. This is part of Pan-African transatlantic ties. And they went to Wilberforce, Howard, Tuskegee, and they were educated there. They came back. And when they came back, apparently, they came back with fancy ideas of equality, thinking that they were equal to white folks, to a point where they were even wanted to date white women. So the settler community at the time was horrified by this, the establishment. So they decided in 1905 to open Fort Hare, which it took almost 11 years for them to implement that decision. And the idea was to turn Fort Hare into an instrument of social control, to produce subservient natives who would not question white supremacy. And of course, Fort Hare turned out to be something completely different. So the linkages go quite far and are still quite important. Now to your question, Chilizi, the importance of leadership. I think it would be starting, especially where we are now, with what has been coming out from the Zondo Commission, which is investigating state capture. One of the things that I found quite interesting, which was said just recently by Mcebisi Jonas, is that we should not over-zoomify the Zondo Commission, meaning that not everything centers around Zuma, and Zuma is not the all of our problems. Because institutions, individuals arise or come out of institutions, and they operate within institutions. Zuma was elected by the ANC in 2007. He did not elect himself. And they were addressing their own issues within the organization. So he became an opening, enabling the organization and individuals within to achieve some of the things that they wanted to achieve. So he was simply an opening. He was a Trojan horse, perhaps, right? So, which then raises the question, he obviously went far, but then, given that these individuals work within institutions, then the question becomes, what then does the institution do in the instances where you have these accesses, right? So we could say the institution of the party failed him, but not only that, because the ANC was re-elected again in 2014, 2009, 2014. So the question then, what does that say about us as citizens? That we would re-elect someone we think so lowly of, Or it may well be that he reflects and pursues some of the niggling issues that we have not addressed in our society. It may well be the case. So the individuals that we elect are a reflection of who we are, not entirely an aberration that we should shun away as if it has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us because we elected him. The second point is, broadly though, I mean, I think there's general consensus that the business sector in South Africa, I take your point, Tony, about all sorts of regulations and bureaucratic inefficiencies. But I think there's sufficient consensus that the private sector in this country has not been investing in our economy. And that for me is a reflection of a broader lack of appreciation for what everyone needs to do to secure our collective destiny. South Africa is in a crisis of identity to some degree. An identity that stems from a failure to acknowledge the past, the meaning of that past, and what it takes to change the society into a different future. When we talk of policies of redress, Bani Pichana and Chris were talking about this earlier on, there's inequalities that we need to address. Land question is one of those issues here. There is a denial of responsibility, especially by white folks and leaders in this country, to appreciate what they need to do to ensure that you have redress, you have opening of opportunities. The private sector and the public sector are pretty much segregated. The private sector in this country is a Bantustan for white folks. And you look at the public sector, it's pretty much black. You go to the private sector, professionals, black professionals, complain about exclusion in these private companies. The reason why the EFF, which talks a lot of unbelievable stuff, the reason why they appeal to black professionals is because it addresses the issue of national grievance. Racism that is mostly denied by white people. So when we talk of collective addressing of the problem, not everyone comes to the party, right? So the land issue for me is an incredible example of that. There is a sense that we need to move on, you know. Let's move on, let's forget the past. And yet the past continues to live with us. There's a reason why in Alexandria, there are black people there. You don't find white people there. There are black people there. There's a reason why in Sandton you have white folks, you know, in the majority because of that past. It is a past that we cannot forget, right? So when you talk of addressing the problems that we face, you're not only relating that to political leadership, but you're relating that to society as a whole. You're relating that to business, not to think of themselves as managers, but as leaders, right? What investment they need to make into securing our future to ensure that we preempt the emergence of demagoguery, which thrives in an atmosphere of inequality. And we have a little bit of that. It doesn't help sitting aside and say, well, we have given you freedom, run this country, look at what you are doing with it. If you are still part of this republic, then you will also suffer hell, right? When things go wrong, you'll be affected. So we need this collective identity, a sense of collective destiny, that things might be a little bit hellish, but we're still here. And the only way we can address these things, one is to be honest, appreciate and admit to white privilege and the brutality of apartheid, and acknowledge that the national grievance will not simply go away because the cause of that pain is still manifested around us. So how do we deal? How do we undo this legacy? Once we get to that point, I think we'll be on to something quite meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tabisi. I will not spoil that. And I would like to appeal with the audience, because of the time pressure that we are in, to allow the conversation to continue in other platforms. We are all scholars, we are intellectuals. Students here have a responsibility to scrutinize the problems that we are discussing here. In their researches, academics have the responsibility to write in the journals of their institutions and elsewhere to pursue this discourse. So we are not ending the conversation, but we are appealing that you find other platforms for the conversation to proceed. I'm going to give you a chance, Ambassador. I have to honor you with that. And with those few remarks, I think we are going to do three things. Ambassador will make his final remarks, and I will call forward Professor Camila Naidu to make closing remarks, and I will make announcements after that. Ambassador Andrew J. Young.
No, I just want to say that nobody says that the way would be easy, but I don't believe that he brought us this far to leave us. Now, I said all the time, when I would hardly make a speech without saying, corruption is stupid. You can make more money honestly in a growing economy than you can steal in a dying economy. Only a fool steals from himself. And you say that enough and people begin to believe it. See? Now, the other thing is, we have developed quite a whistleblower culture in the United States. If you see somebody stealing, he's stealing from you. And there ought to be a box in every office, and if you want to slip something in the box about something you think is going wrong, you need to be able to do that. And the society needs to encourage the possibilities of correcting itself. Now, the other thing is that we can't be pessimistic about it. When you say that we had 30% poverty when we were 1 million people, 30% were poor. We're now 6 million people. We still got 30-some% poverty. It's not the same 30%. We have made significant progress with poor people who were in our housing projects, comparable to Alexandria and Soweto. We got them out, and we sent them to graduate schools, and they became teachers and doctors and lawyers. We had, I don't know what you call them. What is it you call it? The Herman Russell House of Innovative Business. There's a place there's a place that somebody with a business idea can go and be helped. And you cannot ever, there is a feeling that the government has to do it. Government doesn't do a damn thing in the United States. They really don't. You got to drive the private sector, and you've got to get in the private sector. Now, one of the things that helped us back in the 60s, when they started rioting all over the United States, burning cities down, we called a meeting. Your father did that, with black and white business people together, and they said, wait a minute, we don't want to burn our cities burned down by unemployed kids. What's the answer? We create some jobs. In 1 week, 20 businessmen, 10 black and 10 white, got on the phone, they called their suppliers, they created 600 and some internships. Those internships took the kids off the street and put them in, they would come into work with a shirt and tie on instead of hanging out on a corner. Those leaders that summer ended up being adopted by those companies, and they are the junior and senior executives in those companies right now. Carl Ware was one of those, and I talk about him all the time because Carl Ware saved Coca-Cola and put Coca-Cola together with the Canini brothers. White people couldn't have done that. And you have to point up your advantage. And when we're doing business on the African continent, a lot of white people in the United States are still scared to come to Africa. They really are. And you have to do things like this, student exchanges. Of course, I can't complain. I was scared to go to China because I'd never met any Chinese. I was at home with black people. I wasn't at home with a whole bunch of Chinese. I mean, it's part of becoming global. And we're never going to be perfect because I'm never going to be perfect. And if I think I'm perfect, my wife will tell me why I'm not.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Camila Naidu, and the Vice Dean in the Faculty of Humanities. My role is to simply bring this amazing colloquium to its conclusion and to offer some final words. Can you hear me? And to offer a vote of thanks to all those who have been present here for this early session and who have made this colloquium and the later presentation of an honorary doctorate a reality. We are deeply honored to have with us Ambassador Andrew Young, a civil rights legend, for the day, and we certainly hope this is the beginning of a long-lasting relationship with the University of Johannesburg. And I think today has been very exciting. You have certainly passed on a body of knowledge, talked to us about intricate details around your thinking around democracy, and sharing and offering advice. And I like the way you began when you opened up your first conversation to us, which is that the present is very confusing, and we should think in terms of now is now. Ambassador Young has been honored many times, many times before, and we are hoping, though, that this honorary doctorate that he's about to receive is going to be by far his most favorite honorary doctorate. You have recognized UJ's positive energy. As Professor Marwala said, it's our desire to move ahead and forward, to build bridges across institutions and countries. So we thank our Vice Chancellor for setting the scene and for our illustrious panelists, moderated by Professor Welch so brilliantly, and our panelists, which includes Professor French, President Frederick, Professor Pichania, and Professor Landsberg. We thank you for your excellent panel discussion and for reminding us about our history, what framed the liberation struggle, what opportunities have been missed, and what the continuing challenges persist. To Professor Landsberg, you've made this event happen, I think. You've always been the behind-the-scenes man. We acknowledge the major role you've played and you continue to play in other events at UJ. So for me, one of the critical issues that emerges out of the first panel and persists and continues into the second is our thinking about the material conditions of racial capitalism and how to transform that. Everyone has talked about the big challenge of poverty and inequality, and it's clear to see that our Gini coefficient marks us as one of those countries that seriously needs to look at what Professor Patiana has referred to as the tension and the split between the haves and the have-nots. But I also want to highlight a key concern that marks our 25 years of democracy, and that is the question of gender and gender discrimination and gender inequality. When we look at the haves and the have-nots, the poorest of the poor are, in fact, women. And so in follow-up sessions, we need to seriously engage with issues of gender. And it was Andrew Young who said, I think 9 years ago, that I really think that the key issue for the 21st century, for the economy, for health, for education, for warfare, I think it must have been welfare, is going to boil down to the rights of women. And we need to seriously look at this. In the second panel, moderated by Chilitsi Rachintanga, and I'd like us to give him a warm applause for all that he's done. And here I'd like to also thank Ambassador Young, Professor Trigena, Professor Ndletiana, Vice President Carroll, Professor Ware for their excellent inputs on the factors impacting on South Africa's progress. And here again, we largely look at issues around labor flexibility, unemployment, and redistribution. And I like the way in which an ecosystem for innovation and investment was in fact framed. We do have a social security system that is saving us from dealing with the great difficulties of poverty. But I'm not sure, and this is what we need to look at in the future, the extent to which it is sustainable in the way that it is structured at present. So your contributions, panelists, was extremely important to unravel the legacies of the past, but also highlighting the necessity for vigilance and certainly courage to take forward that which has been successful and that which is not. And here we're referring to some of the mistakes of the recent past and the legacies that we have to work through and undo. And I think as one of the last speakers suggested, when we go to the polls, let's think about who we vote, because we can't 25 years from now begin to blame a new president for the difficulties of the current context. A little quote from Ambassador Young again. Ambassador Young said the following: "Changing the world happens one step at a time through acts of leadership and courage. It is a work of generations with progress made possible by those who pass on the lessons learned from both successes and setbacks, and most importantly, the necessary knowledge that change is indeed possible." So we are currently in a historical period where many hard questions are being asked about our present realities, about privileges, entitlements, about the need for redress, about new insights, about new strategies to help us build and defend and advance our democracies and interests of a largely youthful population. So much has changed in 25 years. Rao is now UJ and looks completely different, but there's much more to be done. So we need watchful eyes, as someone said, to defend our democracy and to keep our moral compass focused. And this is a challenge to all of us as we brace ourselves for the next 25 years. So in concluding, I'd like to acknowledge other people who've attended today. Mrs. Zanella Mbeki, I think, was here and has been here. Prof. Sina, Prof. Swart, all the deans and vice deans and heads of departments that might be here. Professor Kinterberger, I think she's somewhere. Dr. Vukuza, for your enormous role that you've played. Maria from OP, leading the library. Mr. Michael McCarthy, Consul General. I think Dr. Vincent Mapai has been here. And from the International Office, I think for all their hard work, I'd like to thank Libete Malefo and his entire team. And most certainly, I'd like to thank our American colleagues, our delegates from the US for coming all the way and for making this a reality. So I think a round of applause for them as well. So on a final note, what the presentations have revealed to me is the necessity for what Andrew Young has stood for all his life: compassionate and courageous leadership. We need not just a citizenry that complains and criticizes and protests, we're very good at that, but one that can influence and put in place mechanisms for real and meaningful change. So I thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Let me add to the list of people to acknowledge and thanks Professor Bashen Welch from the University of Miles, who, as I said, was quite instrumental to get this going, and Manisha and Mrs. Sylvia from Ambassador Young's foundation. All, I think Dr. Vukuza has been acknowledged. These are the ones behind the scenes to have made sure that this is a successful event. with their army of hardworking personnel that I may not know in your names, but I know that you have made this a successful event. Thank you. Of course, I should give thanks to Professor Chinua Achebe once more for hosting us at this venue, and thank the University of Johannesburg for honoring those people. Ambassador Young, your generation of African-American leaders of the civil rights struggle, as well as Chinua Achebe, Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, you bequeathed for us liberated nations. It is our responsibility now to lift these nations and make them fully developed spaces of prosperity for all our people. This is the essence of the have been ourselves. The organization I represent stands out there to connect the minds and intellectuals of African American communities with South Africans and Africans. We are already in conversation with Howard University, Miles University, University of Johannesburg, University of Delaware. We invite you to work with us to make sure that in as much as apartheid was engineered.
I'm trying to intimidate you, but finish.
Can I announce? Okay. So after this, I'm going to sit down and thank you for such a wonderful colloquium. I am of royalty, and we know that our leaders are not always available to be with us at all events. But in the nature of our governance systems, we always have their representatives, their envoys, their ambassadors to represent them on their behalf. This is the case today with our President, Cyril Ramaphosa, who would have loved to be here. But in his wisdom, he has sent his economic advisor, dear Trudy Makaya, who would like to bring greetings from the presidency before we close this event. And I would like for us to please thank President Ramaphosa for making this gesture to greet our friends before they go. Trudy Makaya. After that, there will be announcement as to where we are going to go. I think Professor Landsbeck will do that. May we please welcome President Cyril Ramaphosa.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm told that I have exactly 5 minutes or less, so I will keep it brief. But I thought it's important, Ambassador Young, that we come as the President's office to this event to meet you, meet your delegation, welcome you. I'm sure you've been amply welcomed by this gathering and this institution, but also to underline how much we appreciate your efforts as a long-standing friend of this country. It sounds like you've had quite a weighty discussion this morning around the issues that we face, but we're all reinvigorated by President Ramaphosa's leadership and the work that we have to do to get this country and economy on a different trajectory. Just today, I think this will be relevant to this audience. We had figures come out on foreign direct investment to say that we've reached a 5-year high in terms of the FDI that's coming to this country. So that's great news, and we're very enthused. The President has put investment at the center of his economic policy, inclusive investment, not necessarily investment that creates concentration. So we're doing well, but I must tell you that 5-year high was only $5 billion in US terms. So we're on the right path in terms of the direction of change, but in terms of the quantums that are needed to change this country around, there's still a very long journey ahead, and so I'd love to engage more with members of the delegation, if time permits, just to understand how are you thinking about South Africa? What are your concerns? What do you see as the way forward? Because that's very important. I emphasize the inclusivity of investment and economic growth because we not only struggle with very low rates of economic growth that we have over the past few years, but when we look back to a time when we had high economic growth, there's still questions that could be raised about the rate of employment it generated, whether it fundamentally changed the structure of this economy. So we have to always keep in mind both challenges, to increase growth, but to make sure that it's the right quality and kind of growth. So thank you very much for doing this. I believe you've been doing this for many years, linking our countries together. And I'd love to convey the best wishes of the President. And thank you for your efforts. And thank you to everyone who's here this afternoon.
So I was going to be the one to stand between Trudy speaking and not speaking, but this is the closest I've ever come to power, so I just decided, it should go. So let me now assume my real role at the University of Johannesburg, and that's academic bouncer. Now, this is the time for you to listen carefully now. Please, let's start by first thanking Ambassador Andrew Young once again. Thank you to the Commander-in-Chief of the 4th Industrial Revolution and our team, Prof. Marwala, all the panelists. Okay, so please cooperate with me. You really don't want to have a scrum match with me. Could we please allow Ambassador Young and Mrs. Young to take leave of us? He has to try and squeeze in some rest and get something to eat before the important honorary doctorate ceremony this afternoon. Let's allow Ambassador Young, Mrs. Young, and other members of the delegation to take leave of us. Ambassador Young, you're going to the View for some rest for 30 minutes, and we'll see you at about 2:20. The American delegation, together with our Vice Chancellor and members of the ELJ,